we thought that it's important that we start thinking about the future. And in the last 2 years, future studies has become a very important thing, not only in other parts of the world, but in Malaysia. For example, in the IIUM, future studies has become a very important part of our looking at at different aspects of what we hope that will happen as we move forward. And so we decided to organize a series of roundtables. And we started off with economics, and even the second one today is also going to be on economics. We are talking about utilizing the opportunity that is provided by the last 1 year, whereby COVID-19 pandemic has created so many questions that have affected all of us in all aspects of life. And yet within these times that are really unprecedented, we also see opportunities. And so we thought that it's very important for us to talk about what our current situation is all about, where we are at the moment, and to use some of the discussions that we have in future studies to look at where we want to go, to look at our preferred future. And so in a way, this is what the series, especially in economics, wants to do. And for this second session, we've chosen the topic economic recovery. I was wondering whether to put a question mark after that or not, but we decided to just keep it as economic recovery. Navigating dangers and opportunities, because one of the things that I learned in a few sessions on futures is that we are talking about navigating our way. Yeah? Although as economists, we sometimes feel that we have data, we have the models, we have the ability to forecast, but we also realize, and COVID-19 is a wonderful example, that sometimes whatever tools you have never prepares you for what happens, and therefore it's actually a task of navigation. Yeah, so this is our title for this evening's session, Economic Recovery, Navigating Dangers and Opportunities. We have with us 3 speakers. I'm sure everybody is well acquainted with them. And I believe before the session, the CVs were being displayed. But let me very, very quickly introduce all 3 of them. Our first speaker will be Tan Sri Professor Dr. Noor Azlan Ghazali. And despite his long career, he was Vice Chancellor of UKM. He was has been with the government in the Economic Planning Unit, and then with Majlis Tindakan Ekonomi Negara. But for today, for tonight, he is a Professor of Economics from UKM. Our second speaker, Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, from the UK, but has been in Malaysia for 17 years with a variety of institutions from Uni Razak to Help University, and now with Malaysia University of Science and Technology. Our third speaker, Professor Dr. K.S. Jomo, although we were just talking about this before we came in, there are some people who, even though they retire, the title of professor, it's very hard not to call him with his title of professor, as many of us know him. He has had a long, illustrious career, UKM and then University Malaya. He went to the United Nations, and then he came back. He was with ISIS for a while. By ISIS, I mean International Institute of Strategic and International Studies. And then he joined the KRI as advisor. and now he's with Academy Science Malaysia. So this is our panel for this evening. And the way we're going to conduct the session is we're going to have two rounds. The first round, we will give 10 minutes each to the panelists, and they will talk about what they think the main issues are in the case of Malaysia, pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. So in other words, identifying some of the main issues, especially structural issues that really need to be addressed. So 10 minutes each, and then we go for a second round in which we will be talking about the navigation. How and what do the speakers think we need to move in order to really get back on track? And if I can just say one thing before we invite the first speaker, I'm not sure whether Professor Noor Azlan was involved in the NEAC in 2008, but there is a document that I keep showing my students in Malaysian economy class. I'm not sure whether it's a secret document or not, but I got it and so I share it. The NEAC discussion in 2007-2008, yeah, which showed that Malaysia post 97-98 was not moving on the same track as we were, yeah, before the crisis, and therefore we needed to do something very, very serious in order to not only to get back on track, but to actually meet the goals of Vision 2020. Bold moves were needed, and as I think Geoffrey said it in one of his articles months ago, these are extraordinary times and we need extraordinary measures. So with that very brief intro, can I now invite our first speaker, Tan Sri Professor Noor Azlan, to share his thoughts on the topic. Tan Sri, the session is yours. You need, yeah.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Prof Aslam, and then my friends, Prof Jomo and Jeff, and everyone here. Nice that we spend about 1.5 hours to talk about our nation. You know, you mentioned, Prof Aslam, about the NEAC. I believe that you are making reference to the so-called new economic model that was launched in 2010, if I remember correctly. I even remember the date actually is 31st of March in 2010, because the day after that, Majlis Profesor Negara was kind of being introduced. I remember the date quite well. Very quickly, I will say that maybe if it is not 90%, if it is not 100%, 90% of what has been said in all those, the new economic model are still relevant, and some of the problems are still there, and maybe some of the problems even getting worse. So we really need to go back and to kind of have a detailed look into it. Now, let me go very quickly into the situation that we are facing. You see, we all know about the unprecedented nature of the crisis, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about the health side, but I think our meeting today, we want to talk about the economic side. We all know about measures, stimulus, various packages, various colorful names, Prihatin, Permai, and so on, total up to a few hundred billion. But more important to me, for the purpose of this discussion, I will start by saying that a recovery without reform is a waste. So recovery is one thing. Recovery is probably, to some mind, is about going back to where we were before. And so going back to where we were before, of course, it is better than 2020 in terms of the comfort of living, ability to do business, and so on. But the danger is that if you go back to before the crisis, you are actually will be back on the so-called trap in terms of the structural trap that we are facing. So I would call for reforms, a serious reforms to be looked at. It doesn't mean that it has to happen next year, yeah, but at least in terms of the agenda post-crisis, all those injections of cash, injection of support, all kinds of moratorium and so on are very much, to me, is about kind of survival kind of packages. It's about allowing you to continue to the minimal sense of living and allowing you to operate your business and so on. But it will not by itself allow us to move to a better place. I mean, there are many definitions. I think one of the major flaws, I would say, when we define about going to be a developed nation, our mind are very much concentrated into the numbers. We look into, for example, I think it became at that time a mantra of everybody, 6 to 7% is the only right growth that we need to look at. I believe it is not right, and it is wrong even to interpret that having such a high growth persistently for a number of years is a good thing. So let hold for the kind of the defining the destination a bit later. I have some ideas on that as well. I mean, of course, at that time also, there's a lot thinking about being high income nation, which is good, but it does not necessarily mean you have a better living. Now, I would like to look at what is this crisis telling us. Actually, myself and some of our colleagues, those are being involved in managing the crisis. There's a group, I would say a small team of looking into what's next after this. Looking into what's next and in detail, what are the lessons that we learn from this crisis. I don't want to discuss about how vulnerable in terms of the pain, in terms of how bad people are affected. I think we need some other sessions for that. But most important to me is that we learn from this crisis. This crisis, while no one wants it, but it does. I agree with you. The crisis actually, in certain ways, is something that should be a good wake-up call for us. There is no other wake-up call that probably Malaysia need to wait for. And I think this is enough severity that it allows us to look into what are the problems, what are the challenges, and what that we should do in order to move forward. And just some crude numbers, I would say that 60 to 70% of what need to be done, actually, we know that already. I will say that, we are a bit kind of drowned in our documents. I would urge even stop issuing too many documents. There are so many documents, and my worry is that these documents end up turning to be like spiders, with 8 legs, and everybody go to their directions. Now, what do I mean by that? We know the problems. We know that this nation basically stuck in terms of our ability to transform the nation in terms of several dimensions, I would say. One is about to push the nation entirely. From the smallest to the medium to the biggest, and to the government, to the private sector, is about to use technology. I think we have some serious problem about shifting from something broadly labor intensive toward more high tech and so on. We seem to have problem with that. I just listened to the Academy of Science discussion on innovation. Dr. Hamzah Kassim, many of you know him, that he again repeated, I've heard all the stories before, that we seems to know we want to go there, but we are not able to go there. And of course, there are some issue of executions. There are issue of about do we really know where to go, and do we really make sure that we are moving in the right direction. So this is at least one of the problems. We are a nation that broadly are trapped with a mindset that cheap is good. I think, no, I'm not projecting that it has to be expensive, but I would say that what is needed is actually a fair price. Price across goods, services, even talents. When we pay wages, actually, wages are price of labor. Only that we name it as wages. So the nation are trapped by trying to get something cheap. I'm very worried that sometimes it goes to the public policy sphere, that even the government sometimes try to sell the idea that I'm a good government by making it cheap for you. So we are in, this is a very serious issue, because the moment you try to go to adopt this kind of approach, it will distort many aspects of the economy, all the other changes. I mean, education has to be cheap, health has to be cheap, everything has to be cheap. And the more painful is that the burden of keeping it cheap is on the shoulder of government, which means that it's our own money. The taxpayers' money are being used for all the subsidies and so on. So, but it does not mean that we have to ignore the poor. I don't mean that. I mean, there are ways of attending the poor, but not trying to make it cheap. I mean, the reason that we are in flux with all the cheap laborers, partly because of all of this. You know, if you ask every single person on the road, whether do you like to see more foreign laborers, everybody will reject that. But the moment they say it's cheap, would you like to shift, and then it become a bit more expensive, then people will also reject that. So we are trapped in that sense. Allow me, maybe I have a bit more, 2 minutes or so. The other one is about over dependence on the government. I think we are very Putrajaya centric. We think that the government can solve all the problems. There's an evolution in terms of how the country, not only Malaysia, in all other countries, the role of the societies. You know, if we look at who probably would be better at cleaning the river, is it the society or is it the Jabatan Parit dan Talian? You know, who is better at attending the homeless? Is it Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat or is it the NGOs that are in a full passion of their role and capabilities in attending all this? So I think we need to give space. I'm not saying we don't need government. We need government, but we do not need everything to be done by government. And it is wrong. And it's sometimes I notice that it is also kind of putting too much burden on the government, and you minimize the space of policy because you want to, you know, kind of allowing everybody to be able to get things cheap across all items. Very quickly, last 2 points that I think that we look at is in terms of gaps. Malaysia is a vulnerable nation across income. I have my views about all these B40 and so on, which I don't really agree in the way we use all these measures as a policy variables. I believe micro-targeting can be done better. We have a serious gap when we want to attend COVID. We close the border of the states and not realizing that 40 to 50% of Malaysian GDP is actually residing in Selangor and Seremban. And you imagine that, you know, the concentrations of economy. So this need to be addressed. I mean, to push a bit more so that we can see a bit more growth in other parts of Malaysia. And finally, I think it's about education. I don't want to go too detail into that, but I seriously believe that education need to be changed, need to be relooked at. I'm very worried about whether, because what we all know, the landscape of the economy after this will be very different. And preparing of talents and capabilities to meet these needs of the future will be something very important. And just one last quick one, trust on ourselves. We talk a lot about FDI. We rarely talk about our own domestic investors. Thank you. I think that would be my first kind of run-through observations. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Tan Sri. Thank you very much. I think in that short space of 10 minutes, you have managed to get so many issues in. Just very quick, just recapping some of those. Recovery without reform would be a wasted opportunity. It's a very important point. We have some structural issues, and therefore we need structural reforms. And then you mentioned some of those, the idea of technology. We've been talking about this maybe for almost 25 years or more, and yet we are not there yet. The idea of still relying on cheap labor is something that we can't do, because they're always cheaper countries, in our region. The over-reliance on federal government, I think this is another important point you mentioned, the idea of some form of decentralization. And then the way for us to overcome it, of course, is education. That requires a whole series of discussion by itself. But Jeff, I think Prof. Noor Azlan has really, in volleyball, we'll say he has set you up, because I think we first met when we were talking about the social market economy in the Emirates or something like that, somewhere, and we were talking about the social market economy of Germany as an alternative model, and we said many of the same things that President Noor Azlan was saying. So, please, Jeff, you have 10 minutes to give your thoughts on the issue.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Aslam. I'd like to share a couple of slides, if I may. Because I think
can we just enable Jeff to share the screen?
Yes, he can do so.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. What's going on? Can you see the slide?
Yep. Okay.
Okay. What I want to do, if I may, is just quite quickly go through where we think the economy is and what are the challenges in the near term, by which we mean the middle of the year and then the end of the year, which we're now sort of talking about, could call that a long term almost. And then beyond that, what this sort of means in terms of the development profile. And as Aslam said, we have been doing quite a lot of research on the social market economy for almost 10 years now. And actually, I mean, this is not something that I particularly had known about. Even at Cambridge, I think we had one lecture on the social market economy, which still tells you how seriously they take it. And as a conservative, it's not necessarily a free market conservative, I might say. It's not necessarily something that we focus a great deal on, but having looked at it and having looked at it more seriously and looked at it in the context of Malaysia, this is now something I think that needs to be addressed in the context of what Tanshri was saying, which is where as we come out of this COVID crisis, we do have a very important opportunity to look at structural reform and what that means. And it's not just an economics component to it, there must be also a social component, and perhaps I'll give you some ideas why I feel that there must be a social component to it. We came through the whole of last year sort of in a daze, I would say, through 2020, and I think every one of us has one way or another been impacted by what happened during that period. I certainly have a lost business that was lost, and a lot of my friends and colleagues also lost a great deal of business. And the government did introduce quite a raft of ideas and packages to try to solve that. I don't necessarily want to discuss those in detail, except to say that by the end of last year in Q4, it did appear that some of those packages were starting to work. So if you look if you look in some detail at particularly on the quarter-on-quarter numbers in Q4 of 2020, there were some green shoots that we could point to, and in terms of just about every indicator of national income, consumption and investment, and even exports and imports were all beginning to show some form of activity. But then, of course, we had almost immediately this lockdown on the 13th of January, and this extended to for 50 days, basically. I mean, quite a long period. And that has placed us in what we call, as myself and my colleague Arlo Casadillo at Help University, we call this the survival trap. Basically, we're in a period where people are drawing down on their final reserves in order to get through what we hope will be the end of the worst period in economic activity in my life. I mean, I won't tell you how old I am. I will tell you how old I am, 50. In the 50 years of my life, this is definitely the worst period that we have seen. And we are in a phase now where we're just trying to get through the final period. And we call this a survival trap because people are really drawing down on the last remnants of the resources that they have. for individuals in particular, the main area of concern for me is the withdrawal of the EPF through the IC program, which, as we know, will leave very many millions of people in Malaysia without any form of pension provision. And this is a serious structural issue. This injection of money is actually the main stimulus that we are having in 2021. And without this, I think the government would be really quite stuck on where to get money, because the government has already reached the limit of its resources in many respects. And so we are drawing down now on the final savings of very many millions of people. And I think it's quite important to understand who these people are. These are the poorest people, actually, in Malaysian society. These are people who are approaching retirement, or perhaps some of them are in retirement. Many of these people, because of the income distribution, will be Bumiputra, and they will wind up, all of these people, who are already amongst the poorest and most vulnerable people in society, without anything at the end of this period. And although this might provide a stimulus in terms of overall economic activity, in the end, it's going to lead us to what we call in the middle of the year, after 6 months. The IC payments are paid in a 5,000, up to 5,000 in the first payment, and then spread out over several periods. And if you work that out very quickly, we know very well that within 6 months, the amount that could have been withdrawn will be depleted. So within about 6 months from where we are today, we feel that we're going to face a tipping point in the economy where, if this stimulus package has not had the effect that we would hope, the economy may tip into a further period of stagnation, even mild recession. And if there were a downturn, for example, in the global economy, then that might lead us even into a much stronger recession, or even a depression. I think what we need to understand about this particular crisis, which is different to previous crises, the 98 crisis or the 2008 crisis, is that this is a real shock. This is not a monetary shock. We have never in the history of modern economics had a situation where the entire global economy has been closed down. And there are some people who feel that you just reopen the economy and it's going to spring up again. Well, if the reopening had happened after a month or 2 months, even after a quarter, perhaps they might have had some hope with that type of idea. But when you close down the economy, the entire global economy, for the best part of a year, you are certainly going to see significant structural issues. 2 minutes, is it already? Okay. Now, what this will mean is that after this 12-month, after this tipping point, wherever we are, will determine what will be the future trajectory, whether we're going to go for this high income growth path, which will require a really quite strong rebound out of this current situation, which we're not going to have. Even Bank Negara and the Finance Ministry know that their forecasts of 6 or 7% are not going to get us out of this trap. And the second is the most likely outcome is that we're going to have some growth, but it'll be really rather subpar and probably below long-term growth. And that will stick us back into this middle income trap. I personally don't, and hopefully we can discuss this further, I don't really like these ideas of high income and middle income. In the report we wrote for the KAS on the social market economy, we showed very clearly, first, that it doesn't have any meaning in the economic sense, and secondly, even in 2012, when we wrote that report, Aslam, we forecast that Malaysia would not meet that target, and unfortunately we've been there. And here's some idea of where we are. Very quickly, just to give you some indication. The lockdown during 2020 took GDP in Malaysia back to where it was in 2018. And if Malaysia continues even on its normal growth rate, sort of underlying growth rate that we had before, which is very unlikely to happen, But even if it were able to continue to go into the future at that sort of rate, we wouldn't get back to the 2019 levels until mid-2022. And that's what I mean by recovery. Recovery isn't just that the economy starts to grow again. The recovery means that we get back to where we were. That means that where we're recovering. That means when we've recovered. Some of the significant structural issues, just to tie up and perhaps to lead into the second part of the discussion. First, I've already mentioned the depletion of the EPF and the pensions. I think that this is a very serious structural problem for the economy, affecting not just people in retirement, but also young people. Secondly, there is an issue of unemployment and underemployment, which I spoke about today in FMT. And Fei Kwan covered that very, very well, pointing out that many of these jobs that have gone during this crisis, they're not coming back. And if people feel that the jobs are going to just spring back, they're not going to spring back. And many people are falling into gig economy type jobs, what we call the precariat. And these are very poorly paid jobs. Then there is a problem of private sector balance sheets, which Bank Negara have signaled. This is really, people who took out the loan moratorium are going to have to pay that money back. And that's going to lead to an increase in non-performing loans, and it's going to lead to an increase in social problems for people who are not able to pay that. And finally, there is this issue of investment, which Tantri already mentioned. I think that there are two issues there. One, of course, is how to stimulate and rebuild domestic investment. And the second is how to deal with foreign direct investment, which is clearly not just a problem during the crisis, it's been on a trend decline for since 2016, actually. So there is an issue in terms of those sort of things. Now, in terms of how we respond to that, I hope we'll have a second round of discussion, and I've got some ideas about that. But just to flag what I feel is very important for us to look at is to understand that I agree with what Tantri has said. We cannot look for recovery without reform. It's extremely important. And I think that these reforms have to take into account both the economic reforms as well as the social reforms. And these are some things that we need to focus on.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I know 10 minutes is quite tough, especially when you have diagrams and graphs like this. It's a tough job. Yeah. Thank you. Your points well taken. You've mentioned a few issues. One is that the impact of the last year has taken us back to 2018 levels in terms of GDP, not to mention all the other areas in which we've been hit. And the issues that you have raised is issue of savings, EPF in particular, unemployment and underemployment, private sector balance sheets, and the last one was investment. I think these are all important issues, and hopefully we'll have a second round after this. So we come now to our third speaker, and I think everybody knows Jomo. So Jomo, you have 10 minutes to make your case.
Thank you very much, Aslam. Assalamu alaikum to all. Let me make 7 points very quickly. First, I think it is very important for us to recognize that we live in a world today where slogans are substituting for governance. And I'm not referring to Malaysia in particular. I think we find that that there's a great deal of sloganeering. For example, Mr. Klaus Schwab has promoted the idea of the Great Reset. And I think it's very important in this regard for us to think about the challenges which we face in terms of building forward rather than building back. Okay, the status quo ante was not wonderful. The world economy has been in doldrums since the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, and it's nothing much to shout about to go back. Deindustrialization in Malaysia began from around the turn of the century, and we are all experiencing the consequences thereof. So building forward rather than back is what we should be thinking about. Secondly, I think it's very important for us to recognize that perhaps 4 decades later, Tun Mahathir's appeal for us to look east has been particularly appropriate in the recent period. What distinguishes the East Asian economies from the rest of the world has been precisely their ability to take an all-of-government approach, to take and to involve the whole of society in dealing with the crisis. So outside of Wuhan city and the immediate three surrounding provinces, we find that all the governments concerned at the central level avoided stay-in-shelter lockdowns. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, as early as the 3rd of January, remember that the Chinese only reported the identification of a distinct virus at the end of December. As early as the 3rd of January, Malaysians were already announcing the fact that they were ready because they have experience in dealing with pandemics. Unfortunately, much was done, and the rest of the story we know. And as a consequence of that, we have basically adopted an approach which is perhaps in some ways akin to that of Boris Johnson, in the way that he thought that he could ride out the whole crisis, aim for herd immunity, and so on and so forth. And the consequences we know have been devastating, not only for the UK, but also in the US for different reasons, and as well as in much of Europe. So the failure to have an all-of-government approach has been problematic because we find, for example, very elementary lessons. For example, Malaysia for many decades used to use television for education purposes, but we insisted for almost a year about sticking with digital devices, and even though we knew very early on that only about 6% of children had access to such digital devices and were able to participate in this. So there are all kinds of other issues. We see, for example, in Korea, how they have been able to successfully reorganize public transportation, reorganize the scheduling of work itself to ensure that there are not that many people crammed into public transportation during rush hours and so on and so forth. So the organization of the whole of society, the mobilization of all of government is extremely important. And it's very important, for example, to advise the people, to keep on informing the people, not just in terms of the number of people who have been infected or been reported as infected, or the number of people who have been arrested for some violation of what are wrongly called SOPs in this country, which are essentially regulations, but rather engaging people to understand what we know about the virus in order that they understand the kinds of public policy measures which are being taken to address this. This opportunity to have an all-of-government approach and to involve whole of society, unfortunately, has been sadly lacking here, but it distinguishes the East Asian economies I talked about, including economies much more poorer than ours, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Kerala, in southwestern India, and so on and so forth. The fourth element, which I think is very important, is that we continue to be understandably obsessed with the debt which has been accumulated, and this was something which the former Prime Minister Tun Mahathir was almost obsessed about. But I think this debt phobia, as understandable as it might be, is inappropriate in this present situation. And so we have a great deal of pressure on finance ministers all over the world to try to ensure that their credit rating remains intact by minimizing their borrowings. This in turn reduces the fiscal space for any kind of strong relief and recovery measures which are desperately needed. So I think it's very important that we get away from the traditional obsessions with debt and recognize, as the earlier speakers have emphasized also, that we are living in an extraordinary situation, a situation where this false choice between lives and livelihoods threatens to subvert not only the economy, but also the living standards which have been slowly improving over the decades. So I think it's important for us to recognize that there are other alternatives. Much of the relief and recovery can be done with borrowing, but not on international markets, through revising the legislation involving central bank buying government debt. And this has been done partly because of the influence of modern monetary theory in many parts of the world, and including Europe and of course the US. But although our situations are different from that of the US in a very fundamental sense, that is an option which has been well managed in many other countries, and this is something which we should be seriously thinking of. So it's not a question of going and borrowing from abroad, but rather of being much more innovative. The fifth issue, which I think is the recognition that intellectual property is not only slowing technological progress, but is slowing human progress. And we see how, when Mandela opposed the TRIPS way back in the mid-1990s and fought very hard for the public health exception, this is again so relevant today, where we find not only to test and vaccines, but even before that, even some of the so-called protective equipment and needless to say, medicines have been seriously hampered. So we run the risk, not only in Malaysia, but at the global level, of extending the crisis unnecessarily because we simply want to make as much money as possible from the vaccines rather than trying to ensure that they are mass produced. It is a lie, as it is often claimed in some parts in the world, that developing countries lack the capacity, the capabilities of producing these vaccines. There are more than 70 countries in the developing world which have been able to produce vaccines. I'm not saying that all of them are up to this particular challenge, but surely this is not something accidental. And some of the companies which are, for example, producing the Moderna vaccine internationally, that company has zero experience in vaccine production, but yet the grant was given to them. The award was given to them. So the fight which is going on in the World Trade Organization over the intellectual property and the waiver is fundamental, but it should force governments to rethink, for example, this whole chapter in the Partnership and the Comprehensive and Progress, so-called CPTPP, which basically stands in the way of progress. The sixth point, I think, is that we recognize that some supply chains have been fundamentally disrupted, and some supply chains have only been temporarily disrupted. But we have also seen the politicization of international economic relations. Trump was not alone. Prime Minister Abe also asked the Japanese companies to get out of China, and we, of course, are quite involved with China. And there was some hope by some people that the industries would leave China and come to Malaysia. Very little of that has happened. Indonesia has done much better in this regard, and of course Vietnam and so on and so forth. The last point I want to make is that relief, recovery, and connected with recovery, I think we have a possibility of reform. And this possibility for reform is what I think we should be focusing on. Because to go back to my first point about going back to the past, I think is just not good enough for us. We have to go forward. And this, I think, is the imperative of the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I think in your presentation, you've actually, very nicely also moved to our second round, which is talking about what we need to do. For example, learning from others, the all of government and all of society involvement. And then you also mentioned some of the issues that you feel are still, maybe weights on us. For example, this idea of intellectual property rights and this obsession with debt levels and interest in credit rating of the country. Many of these points that I think we've been talking about, and I go back to Tan Sri Professor Noor Azlan, they're not new, and a few, I think maybe a week or 10 days ago, when a reporter asked, what do you think about the speech that was made about, what the Prime Minister said about something, and my point was, we've heard this for a long time. Yeah, the idea that, for example, we have to talk about education. We know this, and as you mentioned, technology. We've been talking about this for a long time. So it seems as if the reforms that we need to make, if they're going to be effective reforms, we need to figure out how to implement better. What exactly is it that we have a problem in implementation? And I think that is maybe where I would hope our speakers will focus on in the second round. And we're giving 5 minutes this time, because we want to have some time for interaction with the participants. Can I start maybe with Jeff on this first? What exactly do you think we need to do? And it's 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to keep it within 5 minutes. Number one, we need less government, not more government. And I think Tan Sri mentioned this before, and I completely agree. There's too much central planning. People often tell me that Malaysia is a neoliberal economy. I have to tell you, 17 years of living here, I do not see this as a neoliberal economy. This is a very highly regulated, very highly controlled economy, and we are about to get yet another Soviet-style 5-year plan coming out, which is straight out of Chairman Mao. We need a different approach to how the government involves itself in the economy. And actually, at the root of the social market economy is that competitiveness actually should be encouraged at the heart of any economy. And this means less government. We just need to look at the work that Terence has done, for example, Terence Gomez, on the massive number of GLCs and the involvement of the GLCs in all manner of business. And we know that that is crushing in terms of the amount of competitiveness. Another issue is the rule of law. I think some of the speakers have mentioned this, and you also mentioned it in terms of intellectual property rights. But I want to connect this to what Tan Sri was saying about cheap labor. One of the reasons that labor and foreign workers are cheap in Malaysia is because Malaysia's own laws are not properly implemented. And actually, the Human Resources Minister is not getting anywhere near the level of acknowledgement that he deserves at the moment, because the problems that were identified in these rubber glove factories, he has really hit them very hard, and good for him. Because when these type of companies are forced to implement Malaysia's own laws in terms of worker standards, then these foreign workers won't be so cheap. And then there will be better standards for the workers, better quality for the industry as a whole, and Malaysia won't be embarrassed globally because of the people who are not following their own regulations. I think that there's some other issues in terms of promoting startup companies and promoting scale-up companies in particular. Many companies in Malaysia deliberately stay small. And one of the issues that they stay small is a problem with a fear of expropriation. If they get big, if they become successful, they will be forcibly, or in some instances, acquired. And so they want to stay small and they want to keep control. These are the type of issues that, in my view, are holding back domestic investment issues in terms of not just starting up a company, but scaling up a company. Something like 98% of all companies in Malaysia are too small to have any particular economic impact beyond the limit of the people working there, the families working involved in the companies in particular. And I think we also need to look at this issue of the future of work. And I think you've mentioned this issue in terms of technology. What we know in terms of the COVID issue is that the process of the future of work, there was a McKinsey report just last week, the process of the future of work, which is automation, digitization, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, all of these sort of things has been quickened during the COVID period. And what that means is that many of the type of activities that are replacing workers, in the past, when we saw technology, it used to be augmenting people in employment. Now we have technology which is replacing people in employment. And that has very significant implications for the employment profile overall. We just finished a report for one of the technology development corporations in Malaysia, and we pointed out that Malaysia has a very strong comparative advantage in the type of work that resists automation. And looking at that and trying to create higher value in the type of work that resists automation is something that would be unique in the context of a country like Malaysia. And just finally to finish, it's imperative to do this because the competitive pendulum is swinging. During the last few decades, we saw a swing in competitiveness toward Asia. Often that was because of cost competitiveness in terms of labor. Well, that will go away when these technologies start to really kick in. And so the pendulum will then swing back toward the developed economies. Malaysia needs to try to understand that phenomenon much more clearly and provide a response to that. And that will mean focusing on domestic investment, focusing on trade in ASEAN, and I think trying to develop 5 or 6 specialist areas where Malaysia can really be world leading. Islamic finance, for example, Islamic fintech, for example. These type of things where Malaysia is already a world leader are areas where there is a comparative advantage. So there is hope, but as Tanchi said, growth with reform is absolutely essential.
Thank you, Jeff. A few points: less government, not more. How we implement our own laws, major issue. How to promote startups and to allow them to upscale. This is a domestic investment issue. Future of work, major area. And this idea of choosing 5 or 6 areas in which Malaysia can excel in. Thanks, Jeff. I now call upon Prof Noor Azlan to make his 5 minutes of what we are going to do.
Yeah. I believe that whatever you want to do, it has to start with that we must trust ourselves that we can do it. So Malaysia, despite we all discuss a lot of problems, I raised some of the challenges earlier. We have to start by recognizing that we have done it some times back. We started by a nation that maybe more than about 51% maybe in the 70s are poor, whatever definition that you want to use. We started with a very, very agrarian economy and income is very low, and we come all the way 60 plus years. I like to put a kind of this is something that we rarely talk about. We need to put the credits on that. Not just government, but I believe the entire Malaysia, the industries and all the players. There's some in net. I will strongly believe that in net, after 60 plus years of independence, there's more good than bad. But that is not an assurance that this good will prolong. So, part of the danger of having a good growth and success is that we tend to be complacent about change. I believe that Malaysia partly come with all the problems that we are seeing now is partly due to out of what we have seen years back looks good to us, and we insist that the same thing continues. For example, like the price control. I was informed, I remember Tan Sri Islam and Mahbub used to tell me, asking me, when is the price control start? Try to control prices in all these items under KPDN HEP. Not many really remember that it all started with Malaysia trying to curtail communism. Communists, pengganas communists, we all started with that, but now it's suddenly embedded as though as that is the role of government to control prices everywhere. So there are policies that works before, but over the time, it must evolve. And this is a thing that I think missing in terms of us progressing, in terms of the change element. I mean, we become so complacent, and finally, we are maybe initially we didn't realize it, and then we know that we must make a change, and we delay that further. Then finally, we become so afraid of change. Any ideas that goes against the convention, it seems to be something bad. I think we need to open up a little bit, trying to see and to give space. What else that we can do differently? I mean, we need to challenge some of the convention. Let me put it out here. Are we ready to detach national exam from schools? SPM, I mean, get rid of SPM, make it a national exam, but it is nothing to do with the schooling. Can we do that? I mean, everywhere people are talking about students, I mean, talents are now trapped. Schools are now trapped with exams and so on. But when I talk to the headmasters, I mean, the association, they say that, yes, we know what you're talking about, but we were measured by all the A's. The country is addicted to A's, and A's seems to define everything, not only the government, the household, families, parents. Parents are so afraid when their kids are not getting all A's. I mean, this is a major disease in our education. So I believe that challenging some of the convention need to be done. Can we allow, for example, that, you know, as Malaysia progress, now Malaysia is 64 years of independence. We no longer have a society that are so poor and not knowing everything. And on top of that, we have all these technologies now that allow everybody to know almost everything that you want to know by just your fingertips, right? I mean, can we pass some of this over to the society? I like to discuss about education because I'm very much into it. Can we get the communities to choose the headmasters on a competitive basis? Why should we be relying? Why Putrajaya decide who's the headmaster for Mersing or for Besut? Putrajaya know nothing about Besut. You know, I mean, we need to allow this. You know, when we say delegations or bringing it down, it is not just like we do it abruptly. Now, of course, it has to be done systematically. You know, I live in Bandar Baru Bangi. Bangi is Malaysia's Boston. There are 10 universities around us. They are the highest PhD per capita in Malaysia. Do you think people in Bangi cannot manage their own school? Experiment, new models. I mean, I'm not saying that you do it throughout Malaysia, but you got to experiment this. I mean, can we bring down, we talk about, and many other aspects of it. I mean, this is where, we need to challenge certain convention. If the system still works, for example, that when we talk about, let's say, in terms of, in terms of how do we deal with the poor? I want to touch a little bit on this, engross, the nation are stuck with this B40 and so on. You know, you go to the richest nation in the world, they will have B40. Don't worry about it. I mean, B40 is just a line, it's just how you cut it. But if you assume all B40 at 4850 ringgit a month is considered B40, then if you have 4850 in let's say Kuala Kurau, you are not poor. Why do you tell these people they are poor? No, we have a good way of doing targeting. Micro-targeting probably is the best way forward. I mean, we can no longer go with one-size-fits-all kind of policy. So usage of data, Department of Statistics now have, in fact, announced My Local Stat. I mean, we have details information about districts, the way we attend the poor in Johor Bahru urban, and the way we attend the poor in Sikh Kedah are two different poverties. So we need to go down micro-targeting, and these are different approach. So that's what I mean by a less Putrajaya-centric. So meaning that you assign the role and responsibilities. I mean, by saying so, I'm not saying that there is no role for the government. I believe that there is a role for government, there is a role for individuals, there's a role for industries, there's also a role for the society at large. So if we want to move forward, every single compartment of the economy must really understand what role that they need to play in terms moving the nation. Government alone cannot do it, Prof. Aslam. Government alone cannot shoulder all this. I mean, please, government has a responsibility, but government will not know all and will never be able to do all. And Malaysia now has a society. We have Datuk Sri Zaini and the team are ready to clean up the river with the communities, and they are doing it. The way we governing by network need to be considered. So I like to throw this idea of experimenting, trying a new way, a new approach of moving the agenda in our country. Yes, you are right. I think we are out of terminologies, out of jargons. Consultants are paid for jargons now. They are saying the same thing, but it's just a different jargons. I mean, with all the cliche words and so on. So I think I am very, very sure 70–80% we all know what we need to do, and we need to find a way of this to happen. And again, not just government, but every one of us has to be ready. Or if you want to remove all those foreign unskilled workforce, be ready to eat roti canai at a higher price. And I mean, don't ask the government to subsidize your roti canai. I think we have to be ready for that. If you dream to be like all those great nations, you must understand living in the advanced and high income nation are also different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sri. I think central to your point is a change in the way we think of ourselves, trusting ourselves. This is a very, very important point, I think. A lot of this goes to our own issues in Malaysia as a nation. Being a heterogeneous society, this adds and makes it a little bit more complicated. We have to go beyond government. It has to be a society issue, and therefore it's not just government and private sector, but civil society playing a bigger role, as you mentioned, and experiment with new things. I think this is a wonderful proposal, which then leads me to Professor Jomo. If you remember in the 9th Malaysia Plan, if I'm not mistaken, during the time of Abdullah Badawi as PM, he talked about the need to have effective delivery, and he talked about that as one of the pillars of the 9th Malaysia Plan. I believe our current government has also talked about this, saying that we need to talk about better delivery. What are your views about why we've not been able to deliver better? And do you think that we can deliver forward, as you put it that way, take us forward, not only at government level, but also at the society level? Jomo?
Thank you, Aslam. I think it's very important for us to decide what we are discussing today. If we're coming up with wish lists for all the possible reforms which we need in this country, that's fine. I thought we were trying to discuss what needs to be done at this particular conjuncture in terms of how we come out of COVID-19 pandemic better. That's how I was trying to articulate the topic. And I don't really have any quarrels with the wish list. I would disagree on some interpretations about Malaysian history, about Malaysian economic history. It's useful for us to remember that the first draft development plan was introduced in the late colonial period at a point of high Keynesianism, perhaps. But you remember that Keynesian policies were not introduced in the colonies, but it was really, as Tan Sri emphasized, it was really because of the response to the insurgency of the emergency. And so we have to recognize the political character of a lot of the innovations which were introduced. The only period when planning was significant, I would argue, and I've argued this in writing and as well as on many other occasions, is actually during the 1970s. The second Malaysia Plan, and more importantly, the midterm review, was taken very, very seriously. And this continued with the third Malaysia Plan. There were many aspects of the third Malaysia Plan which I would disagree with, but For example, the Third Malaysia Plan included a serious commitment as early as the mid-1970s to dealing with environmental issues. You know, this came out of the Environment Summit in Stockholm. So I think that, you know, to throw out the baby with the bathwater is really unfortunate. That everything, you know, that we have Soviet-style planning. We never had Soviet-style planning even in the 1970s. But I do agree with Professor Williams that it is an anachronism, the kind of planning which we have. And I think Tan Sri Noor Ghazali, Azlan himself worked for some time with the EPU. He's very aware that for all intents and purposes, subsequent plans were almost abandoned as soon as they were published. You know, if you think about the Tun Hussein On announcing his fourth Malaysia plan, and then just before Tun Mahathir takes over, and Tun Mahathir basically almost abandons it within months. And then if you think about Tun Mahathir's fifth Malaysia plan, which you would think he would be more committed to, but within less than a year, he abandoned it as well. So I think we take this whole planning process far too seriously in this country, and I think there is a bit of a figment of our imaginations. But there is a serious point, however, that it is indicative. It is indicative of what seem to be priorities, and there is a real possibility that you make a fetish out of what are originally meant to be indications of where we should be going. And this is the problem with a lot of policy pronouncements where we are basically recycling the latest wisdom, which is supposedly coming from Davos or New York or London or Washington. You know, that is what has been happening for many years now, not only in this country, but unfortunately in many other countries as well. Now, this is the problem which I was trying to address at the outset, and I was suggesting that we need to pay attention to a number of issues and to move on from there. I think it also would be a mistake not to recognize that, for example, Terence Gomez in his really important work on the GLCs also recognizes that some GLCs have actually done quite well, and some GLCs are actually very developmental, you know, and intended to be developmental from the outset. If you think about MIMOS, for example, and MIMOS is, you know, unfortunately, it hasn't enjoyed much support from not only this government, the last two governments, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to recognize that there has been a lot of crap, okay, done in the name of planning. There's a lot of crap which has been happening in the name of expanding GLCs. And particularly, I can share Professor Williams' concerns because we have a situation now where they have the part of the problem with all this is that all this has been partly due to the politicization of the economy, the politicization of business. And so what has happened with this particular regime is that you make the chairman of all these GLCs are political appointees who are members of parliament. It is a formula for disaster, you know, it's a formula for disaster. But I think we really need to recognize that we need to get beyond that. And there are some immediate challenges which we face in this country. And it is those challenges which we need to address. Challenges of, for example, do we commit ourselves to the so-called latest round of strengthening intellectual property, when all the evidence is very clear that intellectual property has led to a lot of problems with such as trolling and the blockage of technological progress and so on and so forth. So we need to take a much more pragmatic approach to intellectual property, because I think it will be impossible almost to reverse the TRIPS agreement, which was introduced 27 years ago. So I'm pragmatic enough to recognize that. But I think there are a number of other issues, you know, very unpopular issues, and I wish my colleagues had challenged me more directly on some of these issues, because I think only through a good public discussion and debate are we going to improve public policy in this country. And one of the big problems in the quality of public policy in this country is that, you know, we are far too polite. We talk past each other. and we don't address some of the challenging issues of the times, such as the question of whether the government should be spending more, should be borrowing more. I've written about why this should be the case. I've also said that there have to be checks and balances. And this obviously involves much more civil society participation, the kinds of things Tan Sri Azlan was also concerned about. But all this can only happen if you have basic democratic freedoms, if you have freedom of the media and so on and so forth. And you don't have the kind of intimidating thing where the appellate court increases the fine which was imposed on Malaysia Kini and so on and so forth. So the situation is bad enough as it is, but we do not have a discussion over the pressing issues of the times, and I do hope we can come back to that. But let's hear from the audience first before we move on to some of these issues. But thank you very much, and I would like to think that my two colleagues' silence on my proposals is a sign of approval, but I'm sure it wasn't.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I agree with you fully. And there is actually a list of proposals that are made, but I think this being the first session that we're organizing for this year, it's kind of listing out. So it's not a wish list, but some of the things that we would like to maybe take up in our next sessions. With the agreement of IDE and the speakers and participants, we started about 10 minutes late. If you agree, we'll go up to 9:40 just to have a good 20 minutes or so of Q&A, and just to give the first question, there's something that's coming from Facebook Live, and I'm just going to maybe read it, and anyone can answer it. What is the effect of Malaysia on depending so much on foreign labor in the plantation, construction sectors, etc.? I believe we could maybe just tweak this a bit and say, how are we going to actually address this, huge number of immigrant labor, documented and maybe even more importantly, the undocumented ones, as a start, especially maybe in this COVID situation where we have these people who are in the country, maybe living in terrible conditions. What do we do if we want to build forward?
Are we responding now, or are we waiting for more questions?
No, we take the question as we go.
This issue of foreign laborers, I think we have to really understand the crux of what is actually the problems. Having more workforce, more laborers is always a good thing. It's a plus, right? But having laborers or foreign workforce that coming into the country that stall our vision is not good. So meaning that if, for example, the truth is in many advanced countries, we all know in all the countries that we will be talking about, there are a lot of foreign workforce there. But of course, in terms of the legality, those are pure immigration issue. It needs to be attended. I agree on that. But in terms of, should we welcome them? Should we not? Again, we must be very clear about where are we heading. If we are talking about going to an economy that applies more technology, applies more advanced methods and so on, then more machineries. It means that we need to make sure that they're coming in are not reversing our vision or our kind of intent to go somewhere. Everyone talk about the 3D. I'm surprised. The dirty, dangerous, and difficult in Malaysia, the same job is available in the richest and the most advanced country in Japan. The same job. Someone need to cut the grass, someone need to climb up and clean up the toilet and so on. Surprisingly in Malaysia, the answer to the dirty, dangerous, and difficult is bring in foreign workforce. That is where the fault starts. We should reverse the 3D. If it is dirty, make it clean. If it is dangerous, make it safe. If it is difficult, make it easy. And how can we do this? We can bring in technology. That's why I think the answer to 3D is not at all a good reason why we need unskilled foreign workforce. And in fact, what we realized out of this COVID, sorry to say, this might be an exaggeration. I think we sometimes cross the border of being foreign workforce, but having a foreign slave in the country. Only now we realize that we never look into their rights, into their housing, and only then when it comes to a problem that now come back to us in terms of COVID and so on. I mean, I believe that everybody deserves a decent living. And if we want to bring in foreign workforce, we have to make sure that it is in line with our purpose and objectives. But again, if we base on what we see now, I think we are not doing that. We are bringing them here because we think they are cheap. And the entire nation, I think I am brave to say that 90% or more is addicted to this cheap labor.
Thank you very much, Sansri. Very important area that really needs a session by itself. I don't think something that can be discussed in a question. Now, there are a few questions. Maybe Jeff and Jomo may want to take one of them or the other. The first one is from Siva, who's from Malaysia now. Has COVID forced the government to embrace a welfare state approach with billions invested through economic stimulus packages to help people cushion the effects? And I'll just add a bit more. Is that something that is good? Yeah. Second question from Lokman Hakim. We heard again and again the need for reform, economics, education, but I think the problem is lack of political will of the government to reform, probably because of the race-based politics in Malaysia, and therefore there is a problem with political will. Second question. And the third question, very insightful thought from speakers. I'm concerned about the benefits of the RCEP agreement will outweigh the cost. Whether the benefit of the RCEP agreement will outweigh the cost. While this agreement will open wider market access to Malaysian companies, our companies in Malaysia are ready to compete with Korean. Are our companies in Malaysia ready to compete with Korean, Australian, and Chinese companies? Will this lower inflow of FDI? So, Jeff, Jomo.
Let me just, I want to comment on all of those questions.
Quickly.
Let me just comment on the first. I think the first question was about whether the government is proceeding toward a welfare state because of intervention during the COVID crisis. Actually, if you look at the amount of money that the government is putting into the economy during this crisis, it is actually nowhere close to what one might imagine. We often hear this figure of 305 billion ringgit by way of an injection, but it isn't anywhere near that actually, because the actual amount of money that's being placed into the economy is relatively little. And as I mentioned before, there is about 40 billion coming during the course of 2021. That is not coming from the government. That's coming from the pension funds of the poorest people in society who are carrying the weight of the policy decisions made by the richest people in society. And that's what's going on here in Malaysia. Is the Malaysian government moving toward a welfare state? No, it's not. It's nowhere close to being to moving toward it. It has no chance. It's not interested in moving toward a welfare state. No, of course it isn't. And just to comment a little bit on this foreign worker issue, if I may, just very briefly. I'm a foreign worker, actually. Although people say that I'm an expatriate and they use, highfalutin words, but the fact is that my salary is now 1/4 of what it was when I first came here 17 years ago. And the reason for that is that it doesn't matter where you come from. Foreign workers have no capacity, even me, we have no capacity to enforce our rights in law, which are already there enshrined in Malaysian law. And as I mentioned earlier on in the comments I made about the glove companies, if foreign workers were given the right form of treatment in terms of pay and conditions of work, they would not be cheap. And Malaysian law provides that they are in fact given those rights, but unfortunately, because of the lack of enforceability and because of lack of, I'm not going to say political will, because as I mentioned, I think the current minister does have the political will to enforce these regulations. And if they are enforced, that will improve the conditions of farm workers. It will also make farm workers more expensive, and then that will also make Malaysian workers more competitive in that market. So that's my view on it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Jomo, the question on reforms are pulled back because of race-based politics, and that creates lack of political will. And the second one, the RCEP agreement, costs and benefits.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't really quite catch the first question, but let me register my agreement with Jeff, Professor Williams, on both the issues he commented on, that we are far from being a welfare state. And in fact, the discussions of how to help the people who are most deprived in this present situation has come along a long way compared to even, say, 10 years or 15 years ago. So I think extending relief measures is hardly constitutes a welfare state. And I think that has to be emphasized. And I also very much appreciate his comments about foreign labor. And this is where I think I may have to disagree with Tan Sri Noor Azlan, because it is not simply a question of the Home Affairs Ministry. The fact of the matter is that, as I think Richard Ryat, who was Minister of Human Resources, said, there were 6.7 million foreign workers in the country around 2014 or 2015. Now, when you consider that against the size of the labor, which was about 15 million, and this included about 2.2 million foreign workers, documented foreign workers, that implies that there were another 4.5 million undocumented foreign workers. In other words, 2/3 of the foreign workers in this country are undocumented, with all the implications which Tan Sri emphasized, the 3D jobs and so on and so forth, and Professor Williams also emphasized. But I think the key point is that it is actually stifling change. I mean, I remember decades ago, maybe you're all too young to remember this, but in the 1980s, there was this big debate over the whole question about the mechanization of harvesting of palm oil fruits. And the solution was to bring in more foreign workers because Malaysian workers were migrating out of the plantations. The plantations were making a lot of money, have no doubt about it. But given a choice, they opted for foreign workers. So we have a situation where this situation has huge ramifications. It is slowing down technical change in very important ways and holding back economic progress. As far as the RCEP is concerned, I think it needs to be said that most of the more onerous aspects of the TPP are not in the RCEP. And you see, the way the TPP was negotiated, it was basically, more than 600 advisors were officially recognized for the US team. So they basically wrote the legislation. They wrote the legislation, and it was the other negotiators who might find a little bit of fault. And the Australians, for example, objected to using ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, for tobacco products and things like that. So there were things which were carved out and so on and so forth. But it was essentially driven by the US. What originally started off as an attempt to encircle China also became a sort of an example of what the Americans call pork barrel politics, And so we have the worst possible process in terms of the kind of legislation which was drawn up in the TPP, which was then confirmed, because it was easier to do so after Trump TPP. And without recognizing the reasons which led to Trump pulling out and so on. So this RCEP is considered to be a low-level plurilateral trade agreement without all that much to offer. And so I'm not as concerned about it. I'm sure there are problems with it, but I'm not as concerned about it as I am with the TPP or the attempts to revive the TPP. And one issue in particular is the fact that they are trying to extend the scope of intellectual property to cover biologics, which refers to naturally occurring substances. This is completely anathema to many belief systems that you can actually own, that you can privately own the idea. For example, just imagine if somebody insulin from animals is suddenly owned by some company because they have developed some means of adding it. The implications are huge. Hepatitis C, the vaccine, sorry, not the vaccine, the treatment for hepatitis C, which affects almost 500,000 people in Malaysia. The treatment costs almost 300,000 if you pay for the patented one. Fortunately, the Malaysian government negotiated with the Egyptians, and they've got a treatment for which costs about 1,300 for a 12-week treatment. So, you know, I think the full implications of this are not realized. We all go by these slogans of having a 21st century trade agreement and all this nonsense. I don't want to use curse words, otherwise it might be censored in future. But you know, it is really nonsensical, and the naivete of many of the politicians in trying to sell this as something in the interest of the nation is only all too sort of you know, embarrassing, really. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have just the last round of questions, although it's going to go across 9:40, but I want to ask these two questions because it's coming from students of Malaysian economy in the IIUM, and the questions really sound good, so I want to, you know, promote the class. So the first question from Hana Zawawi. Given that Malaysia currently is a country very dependent on the government and at the same time having heavy central planning, what should the route to less central planning look like? Do you think that an empowered society can grow despite the government's reluctance to let go of central planning power? So that's the first question. The second one is from Anik Roslan, and I thank him because he also got some background data on the topic today, which I didn't have time to present. Micro-targeting is a great idea. Nobel Prize winners, Duflo and Banerjee spoke about this. How do we administer the data needed to move in this direction? I say this because current data availability and openness in Malaysia itself is rather poor. So how do you get, you know, over this data availability and accessibility problem? And of course, there's also the one more question on the race-based politics, if you choose to answer. So those will be the three last questions. Maybe whoever is ready, if you're ready, please.
I'll take it up first. I mean, I'll try to be quick. I know all these are a very important subject of Malaysian economy. I'm a strong believer that the way we do government must change over time. Again, I'm not saying government is not needed. I'm saying that the way we do government has to change. There is a term, I mean, see, there are some students of economics there. Go and check on this post-modernization society. You know, as simple as this. When the society progresses, when income goes up across the board, then you start to see that the interest on public issues are becoming more. Meaning that individual citizens can no longer see the river being polluted. Individual citizens can no longer see homeless. Individual citizens can no longer see even the animals are not being fed rightly. You know, so these are all characters. I believe that Malaysia's, though, yes, we do have a low-income group in Malaysia, but we have these elements of a post-modernization in the country. They care more about public, they care more about environment and so on. and empowering them is something doable. Whether you empower or not, they will do it first. I mean, today, not much of the rules and regulations are preventing them. If we look at the homeless, for example, you look at whenever there are floods in Malaysia, among the first to arrive, even if it is not earlier, is actually the NGOs. So we need to promote this. Only that we have to make sure that some element of governance in terms of collecting public funds has to be properly in order and so on. I think Malaysians are ready for this, but of course, I like the word of experimentation. Yes, you are right. I mean, question number 2 talking about Daflo and Banerjee, they use a lot of experimentations. So Malaysia must continuously explore new ways. I mean, the government especially, I mean, allow the public to come and experiment. This is what I like. I mean, some of the good decisions by, I think, the government recently, for example, when they talk about the sandbox, the idea is that you put all the problems of the public problems in one sandbox and let the private citizens, NGOs, and so on to come and to basically to take part in bringing the solutions, because some of the good ideas are out there. And finally, in terms of the data, I mean, probably some of you know that I'm quite involved with the current situation at EAC. Data is indeed one of a major issue in Malaysia. It is not that we don't have the data, but the way we govern the data, the way we use the data, the way we share the data, are pretty much need to have a serious reforms. I mean, all agencies are collecting all sorts of data. We sometimes get in the mess of defining what is the true poverty in Malaysia. You know, on top of that, there are a lot of economic issues in terms of all these measurements. I strongly believe that if it is truly something so secret, then we don't need to share that. But the more we share the data, the more we share all this information, I think the better it can be. The public at large, when they have more information, more data, I think they can act, we got to trust them. They got to act more effectively. So these are the new dimensions, the new landscape of government. Prof Aslam, allow me just to touch a little bit on what Prof Jomo mentioned about, I mean, his concern. I heard him say a couple of times about, you know, we are so worried about trying to take more debt, worried about the ratings of the country will go down and so on. You know, I will say that, you know, in the last few years, the obsessions of looking into debt and is so much in Malaysia. Even everyone discuss about the debt of the nation, and sometimes they get confused. I believe that debt is important for the right time, for the right use, for the right purpose. As long as it is in a proper order, good governance, and we can serve the debt, there shouldn't be any problem. I mean, there should not be any unjustified fear. You know, I think that such that, you know, I mean, it is wrong. I mean, rich nation borrows a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Noor Azlan, for the comments. Jeff?
Okay, I'll be quite quick and leave the final word to Prof Jomo. To answer the question, which I can usefully read from the chat, what would a route to less central planning look like? I think the first step along that road is don't publish the next Malaysia plan. Don't publish it. As simple as that. And start afresh. Start a new discussion involving a wider range of people from every part of society. Do I think that the empowerment of society can grow despite government's reluctance to get rid of central planning powers? The answer is no. Simple as that. Now, on this issue of data, Malaysia has a shocking data problem. We can't even get basic economics data, as you know. Now, I actually did my PhD with the national income accounting, or part of it at least. So I know something about that. At the time when I was doing that, the Office for National Statistics in the UK thought that they could actually sell the data that they were producing, raise the money, and use that money to improve the quality of the data. It was an absolute failure, utter failure. Okay? The simplest way of improving the use of data, the quality of data, and the involvement of people in the data process, make it free. All of it. Just put it out for free. Give it to us. Give us the data and let us use it. The problem is that, of course, you need to anonymize it, and you can't allow people's private information to go into the public domain. But when you're talking about national income accounting and things like this, there really isn't an issue of that sort of privacy. If you put the data into the public domain, people will use it, people will be interested, and you will improve the quality, not just of government decision-making at Putrajaya, but decision-making at the local level. But that requires free access to every piece of information that the government has, data-wise.
Thank you, Jeff. I really wish somebody is hearing this, and taking it. The idea of data has always been major challenge. I know the Department of Statistics has made a very good effort to reach out to universities. They do give us access to data. But from what my colleagues say, this data is very basic. And once you want to go into the more detailed, sets of data, then you have all these problems. So this is really something that we need to talk about.
Yes. The data.
Yeah.
I think I can share it here. The recognitions of it is reaching to the highest level. At EAC, we recognize this very well, and I think we look forward for the change in the regime of managing the data. I hope that we really come to that stage. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it goes back to your point about trusting people. Even if somebody wants to criticize and whatever, it's okay, let them, and then you answer it back. Jomo, your last say.
Yeah, let me just echo what Tan Sri and Jeff have said about data. Although I must say that with Dato' Uzair in charge of the statistics department, we have seen a little bit of progress. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that progress, because there is a cult of secrecy in this government, which is very unfortunate. But also this idea that everything is commodifiable, which Professor Williams faced when he was trying to do his PhD. Unfortunately, it has gone far and wide. And one of the first battles I had to fight when I got to the UN was precisely over the question of there were attempts to try to sell data and so on. But let me move on very quickly to the question of randomized control trials, Duflo and Banerjee and Kramer. I think this is really overdone. I mean, this is a fetish of the British DFID, Department of International Development, which has got very little to show for itself. Yes, they have sponsored some very innovative studies, and I think most people would agree that they are very clever. Duflo and Banerjee and Kramer are all very clever people. They're certainly no fools. But at the same time, when it comes to actual policy, what have they done? The costs of doing that kind of micro-targeting are huge. Nobody talks about transactions costs in all these talks. And that's why I tend to share Professor Williams' sign of, reluctance to have, this overbearing so-called nanny state, where you have a bureaucracy which is supposed to be all about poverty eradication, which eats up far more than the poor ever get out of the whole thing. So I very much share that sentiment. But the last point, if I understood the question correctly, I think it's very important to establish that the only study ever done on income inequality in this country, which used the field decomposition analysis to look at income, found that less than 5%, less than 5% could not be explained by other factors. In other words, for want of anything better to do, you can attribute it to ethnicity. Okay, so we are talking about policies which have been used in this country for the lifetimes of most of us, which are actually very unlikely to yield anything. But undoubtedly, and this is the frustration which I think Professor Williams talked about, undoubtedly they have been used to great advantage of business people as well as politicians. So I think this is the problem which we need to face. To recognize that although the talk is about helping the poor Malays and all the rest of it, in effect, they have been used to enrich a great number of other people. I mean, just look at that, everybody who knows anything about Kelantan knows, for example, that, more than 60 years after independence, you still can't get clean water out of a tap in Kelantan. Okay? And that is estimated to cost about $1 billion. But somehow or other, we are told that the East Coast Railway link, which is going to cost about 5 times as much, not 5 times as much, 50 times as much, okay, over 100 billion, is somehow or other desired and going to help the people of Kelantan progress. So people are being taken for a ride all the time, but unfortunately, we are the world's leaders in ethnopopulism, and unless we address the whole question of ethnopopulism and allow a healthier discourse on this issue, I'm afraid it's going to continue to dominate not only public policy making, but a great deal of our imaginations for no particular advantage to most people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo, and thank you very much to our speakers, Geoffrey Williams, Azlan, Ghazali, and Jomo. Thank you to all the participants who stayed with us for almost 2 hours, and all the questions that were raised. I believe we even had a Zoom attack on us, and we were getting all kinds of funny things in the chat, and we had to close it down. Although I can't imagine why anybody would want to disrupt this discussion. But it's been a very lively session. Because it's the first session of what I hope will be many to come. What we're going to do, and this will be done, Anik maybe has left for another meeting. We will be writing up, what we have said today and identifying some of those areas that we would like to take maybe in more detail. Certainly, issues of GLCs is one, intellectual property rights and their impact on, moving forward is one. The whole issue of foreign labor is another area that we need to talk about. And future of work. I mean, I think this is something, very, very relevant to us. I mean, I know I was telling Jomo, this is my 5th session today. I'm almost reaching your levels, Jomo, on this. Yeah, it began in the morning with long meetings, and so this working from home thing is not actually giving you more relaxation, at least not today. So really, future of work is something that I think really needs to be also looked at. So we will hope to have more sessions. We will be experimenting, to use Professor Noor Azlan's term, on how we can best conduct these sessions. We had one format in November. We went back to the older format. We may try to see how we modify the format so that we can organize these kind of sessions once a month. I mean, this is our target. But how to get more people done within this time frame of 1.5 or 2 hours maximum. So with that, I thank everybody again. Thank you to IDE and all the co-organizers for this session. I hope that we will be able to have more sessions in the future, talking about restructuring the Malaysian economy, moving forward better. Yeah? That's the new term now. So with that, thank you once again. Inshallah, we will see everybody back again in the future. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
And thanks to you and my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
That's it. Thank you very much for spending your time. And Jeff, yeah, thank you.
No problem.
My pleasure. Anytime.